All right, so I want to welcome everybody to the next webinar for the Federation of South Toronto Residents Association Homes for All Working Group. And we'll just be starting our webinar in a minute or two. We're getting some people coming in right now. And there we go. And once again, we'll be starting our webinar in just a moment while we have some final entries coming in, and we'll get her going. And perfect. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our FoSTRA Home for All Working Group next webinar with the theme of Housing for All. We want to thank our members and new friends who have taken the time to attend this presentation. Also, we're honored tonight to have representatives of constituency office members from our provincial government. Chris Glover, MPP from Spadina-Fort, York, will be here for introductions. And Asaya Barak, constituency assistant for MPP Councillor MPP Wong Tam. She used to be our councillor, but now she's an MPP for Toronto Centre. So we plan on bringing you more of these educational experiences over the course of this year. And just a few housekeeping tips before we begin. First, for purposes of our minute taker, we are recording this presentation. A link to the minutes, the complete webinar slide deck, and other valuable links will be available shortly after the webinar. Now let's take a look at some of our team's protocols. And I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. So we're starting off the webinar tonight with the microphones muted and the cameras off. You just notice the icons that are usually at the top of your screen, depending on how you've logged in. And the icons will assist you in making a reaction to the comments that have been made, and some of the introduction to the chat, etc. So we've got our microphone control is in the shape of a microphone, camera control, of course, in the shape of a camera. The chat icon and the reactions icon are all listed there so that you can raise your hand or put a question in the chat. And we have our meeting now called to order. And I'm Mike Bethke, and I'll be the chair for this meeting. Many hands went into the developing of this presentation and now work behind the scenes to bring this to you. I want to thank Liz McGroarty, who is our timekeeper with the unfortunate job of trying to keep me in line. And thanks go to Don Young for his on-screen work tonight. Our agenda is on the screen right now, so you can see that we have our Indigenous land acknowledgement, an introduction of FoSTRA with some of the resident association members. We want to acknowledge our special guests, and then we go on to the presentation by Franz Hartmann. We'll finalize with a bit of a Q&A. So I would now ask Don Young to read FoSTRA's Indigenous Land Acknowledgement.
Okay, FoSTRA acknowledges that South Toronto has been the site of human activity for at least 15,000 years. It is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Today, Takaranto continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and to work in this territory. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to strive to make things right. As a treaty people, we commit to listen, to learn, and to work towards justice and reconciliation.
Thank you, Don. First, I'll start this presentation with a bit of an overview of FoSTRA. Our members consist of residents association within Toronto wards 4, 9, 10, and 13, as well as Ward 11 south of Bloor. We're always welcoming new members and new residents associations. Following from our key issues in the next slide, property development must be responsible, respectful of community identity, and aligned with long-term planning objectives. This is one of FoSTRA's initiatives as in number 4, affordable housing. This Homes for All group's raison d'etre is housing should be a human right and everyone should be housed either through private enterprise or government support. And next, we have some special guests this evening, and we're honored that we have representation from our provincial government here this evening. Chris Glover, MPP from Spadina-Fort York, and Asiya Barak, Constituency Assistant for MPP Wong Tam, Toronto Centre. And we thank MPP Kristen Wong Tam for including our invitation in our most recent newsletter. And I'll now ask Chris Glover to make some opening remarks and introduce our guest speaker for tonight.
Okay, can you hear me now, Michael?
We're doing good. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, great. Thank you. You know what? Thank you so much for organizing this. When I talk to people in the neighborhood, housing is the #1 issue. Affordable housing, even people who have housing, are finding that they're being priced out of it. Anybody living in a place that's built after 2018 does not even have rent control. So at any point, their landlord could increase their rent by any amount. And then we've got a homelessness crisis, and this homelessness crisis has been, really came to the fore during the pandemic, and it's not just our riding or our city, it's across the province. So I thank you so much for organizing this. We know we need to get to the solutions. We need to build the housing that we need so that, we can achieve the goal that FoSTRA laid out, which is that everybody has a home, either through the market or through government support. So thank you again so much for doing this. And it's my honor to introduce our main speaker this evening, who's going to be talking about some of those solutions. So Franz Hartmann, thank you for being here. Thank you for being our guest speaker. Franz is the coordinator of the Alliance for Liveable Ontario. Prior to this, Franz was the executive director of the Toronto Environmental Alliance, or T, for 11 years. He also served as chair of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance and helped the Alliance build vast community support for the Greenbelt. Prior to working at T, Franz was the environment advisor to Jack Layton when he was a city councillor and oversaw Layton's civil society engagement activities in Ottawa. Franz Hartmann has a Ph.D. in urban environmental politics from York University and has taught numerous courses over the years. Franz, thank you so much for being here. I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and welcome everyone. Just to let you know where I am, I'm actually in Ward 9. I'm near Bloor and Dufferin area. So, and looking out a window in my third floor of my house, and the sun is setting. It's absolutely gorgeous. So I'm just going to share my screen and hope that this works. and bear with me. And everyone can see that?
I'm good.
Okay, great. I'm going to be talking about presenting a very simple blueprint for solving the housing crisis in Ontario. And just to give you a sense of what's going to happen over the next half hour or so, I'm going to provide you a brief overview of the Alliance for Liveable Ontario. My apologies. Then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about what's driving the housing crisis, because having an understanding of what's behind the housing crisis, it helps suggest what are the solutions. Then I'm going to talk about what the Alliance for Liveable Ontario is doing to build public support for the right solutions. And that's essentially where the blueprint is going to come forward. And then I'm going to end with what you can do. So first of all, a bit about the Alliance for Liveable Ontario. We were actually conceived of back in September of 2022, when a small number of us got together and said, we don't accept the framing that the provincial government is putting forward regarding the housing crisis. That framing, as I think most of you know, is that we have a housing crisis, which is absolutely true. But the only way we can solve it is by sacrificing some environmental laws and regulations, sacrificing agricultural lands, and sacrificing some important democratic principles in order to solve it. We didn't buy that, those of us who are kind of at the founding media of the Alliance. And we said we need to work together to counter that, because the framing and the solutions that were being offered by the provincial government, frankly, were not very, were not helpful. In fact, they were very destructive. So 2 or 3 months later, we formed. And as this says, and this is straight from our website, we are an alliance of people and groups representing hundreds of thousands of Ontarians from many different sectors. We want to build, excuse me, a livable Ontario and stop the provincial government policies that falsely claim they will solve the housing crisis facing us while harming our communities and undermining the protection of our farmland, natural areas, and democratic institutions. And a bit more detail about who we are. We have over 1,000+ members from representing over 220 groups, representing literally hundreds of thousands of Ontarians. And they come from our members, and the groups that are part of this come from the agricultural community, the urban planners, environmentalists, housing affordability activists, tenant activists, neighborhood associations, labor groups, healthcare, academia, businesses, developers, and many, many more. We have essentially three platform or three objectives. And the way we frame it is saying, well, what's the sort of future we want to build? And there's three parts to that. The first is we welcome a growing population accommodated through government, private sector, nonprofit, cooperative, and charitable partnerships that build and protect affordable mixed-use housing situated within communities that offer a variety of transportation options. Secondly, our communities, we want communities that are vibrant, healthy, affordable, climate resilient, and surrounded by permanently protected farmland and agricultural areas. Third, we want the provincial and municipal governments to work together to be real partners and make planning and infrastructure and housing decisions that build sustainable and healthy communities. Fourth, we want all political parties to reflect our agenda in their party platforms, which means we are nonpartisan. There are members from every political party in Ontario that are part of the Alliance. And fifth, we want all political parties to uphold democratic principles, as well as practice public consultation, engagement, and transparency. And the way we plan on doing that, and the way we have been doing that over the last year and a half almost now, is we're building a big tent of individuals and groups from very different sectors. And what I like saying is that when you're inside the tent, we focus on these five goals, and we leave our disagreements outside the tent. And this provides a really interesting space for fascinating stuff to happen. So how do we plan to make change happen? It's by building a collaborative, inclusive alliance with groups and individuals seeking to fulfill these five goals. We communicate our message. It's all about communications. It's we want to inspire leadership from across sectors to champion our agenda, and we want to create a multi-year plan to ensure short-term actions build to the future. Too often, many of the groups that participate in this are busy, what I like calling firefighting. The province announces something and all of a sudden we have to respond to it. The Alliance is a space for groups to get together and say, let's plan ahead. Let's plan 2, 3, 4 years down the road. We have a website with a growing number of resources on it. This is just a very, very small snapshot of resources. We, of course, we're very involved in the fight to stop the Greenbelt lands from being developed. So I invite you to go to our website and look at the resources that are there. I hope we've got I know that there are resources there that will help you. We've had webinars where we've brought in some amazing guests to help provide hope to the solutions that I'm going to be talking about this evening. So to learn more, of course, just go to liveableontario.ca and have fun there. And I hope that there is material there that you enjoy. Now let me turn to what's driving the housing crisis and our blueprint. Number of months ago, we sat down and said, we need to have something that we can talk about, that we can present to our members, that summarizes how we want to solve the housing crisis. And that began a journey of talking to a large number of people and also to reading a lot. And so collectively, we said, well, we want to throw together some sort of document. We didn't know at the beginning exactly what this would look like, but we knew we had to do our homework. And we had to read a lot of reports. And as I found out, and as I'm sure many of you know, there has been a lot written over the last number of years, especially the last couple of years, on the housing crisis, or more aptly, the housing crises that are out there. A lot of solutions, a lot of ideas, a lot of explanations about why we have the crisis, etc. And so we've been doing our homework. And what I'm about to present is my version of what I've learned, or what we've learned. I'm no doubt that there are other Alliance members who would have a slightly different interpretation of this, but the point of all of this is to say that we have been doing our best to understand what's out there and to summarize the information in a way that is understandable to people. Because if you're not a housing expert, this can be really, really, really confusing. Because there's a lot of very challenging, difficult, complicated issues at play. And secondly, because it requires a level of knowledge and understanding that the vast majority of us, including myself, just don't have. That involves planning laws. It involves understanding the business of development and housing building. It's complicated. So our hope is that we can simplify this in a way that makes sense to people. So the way I like to think about this is what's causing the housing crisis is that it's like a bad recipe. There are a whole bunch of different ingredients. No one ingredient is more important than the other. It's the mix of it that's a problem. And the first ingredient I want to talk about that I think is key to driving the housing crisis is that we've been building in the wrong places. I want to just read this quote from Sharice Berta. She's the Executive Director of City Building Institute at the Toronto Metropolitan University. Sharice, who I happen to know, has been active in this space for a very long time, extremely well read, a great writer, great communicator, and most importantly, very wise. And in a recent blog post that she put up, she wrote this. And when I read it, I thought, boy, that kind of encapsulates why building in the wrong place is such an important issue to raise. And I'll just read it out loud. Where we build is fundamental to getting housing right. In fact, the International Panel on Climate Change's most recent assessment report cites that spatial and land use planning offers high potential to address most of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and offers the greatest strategy to reduce GHGs from transportation. Put simply, how we build and design our cities has a huge impact on the relationship we have with the natural environment. And if we do it wrong, we worsen that relationship. If we do it right, we can actually help improve that relationship. So where we build housing and where we build our cities and how we build them is absolutely fundamental. And I doubt this is news to many of you, but I think it's important just to kind of mention this. And when I saw this graphic, I just, again, it was one of these, boy, I'm going to be using this for a long time. In North America, especially, there are effectively two different approaches to city building. And this is beautifully illustrated in these two maps. One is from Atlanta, and this is based in 1990, and the other is from Barcelona. And as you can see there, Barcelona and the black areas actually are this is to scale. And you can see Barcelona is maybe 1/8 or 1/9 the landmass of Atlanta, but actually has more people in it. Yeah, well, in fact, it's 162 square kilometers versus 4,280, like a huge difference. And this kind of exemplifies the two very different approaches to city building and to creating communities. And for decades here in Ontario, land speculators, developers, and government planning rules have made it easy to push essentially the Atlanta version, what many of you know as sprawl or suburban sprawl. And this is a typical example of suburban sprawl, this picture. Now, I could go on for the next hour talking about the key problems with suburban sprawl, but I want to just summarize this. And this has been now acknowledged by an increasing number of housing reports. It's expensive for municipalities because it requires a huge investment in infrastructure, so-called hard infrastructure. You have to build the roads, you have to build the sewers, you have to build the bridges, you have to build all these extra things out far into new lands. That costs a lot of money. And therefore, it's also expensive for residents because they got to pay for that through their property taxes. Usually, suburban sprawl creates building types, single-family homes, that are big and typically not affordable. Another key problem, of course, is that suburban sprawl is car dependent. Sprawl was built for cars. It was not built for walking and cycling or other transportation modes. And sprawl neighborhoods typically are far away from where people work and live and hang out and spend time, which means they're driving all the time. And of course, I would say as importantly, sprawl destroys precious farmland and natural areas. And as the climate crisis worsens, as droughts become more prevalent across the planet, as our ability to import food is reduced, we're going to depend more and more on the farmland here in Southern Ontario to feed us. And we're going to depend more and more on the natural areas, especially those protected by the Greenbelt, to provide us with important ecological services such as flood protection, cleaning our water, etc. Sprawl destroys all of those. More recently, there has been a push towards building a different way of building, and probably closer to the Barcelona approach. That is building within existing towns and cities through increasing density and doing so in a way that is sustainable and creates more affordable housing options. And these are just two examples of what that looks like. The benefits of livable density, of course, are you get more housing options made available to you. It's not simply single family homes. The municipal taxes are lower compared to sprawl, at least, because you are essentially using existing infrastructure that's already there more efficiently. There are many more transportation options. People don't need to drive all over the place. In fact, driving becomes more of a hassle than anything, as I think all of us know who live in South Toronto. Driving sometimes is the slowest way to get somewhere. Livable density has a much lower carbon footprint, and it's more climate resilient. And it also preserves farmland and natural areas, because every home, every house that is built within an existing town and city takes away the pressure to build on farmland and natural areas. Since 2018, after the Premier Ford and his party were elected, we have unfortunately moved back in time, and there's been a constant kind of two competing stories taking place. Premier Ford has been very actively pushing a message of what, what I like to call kind of the white picket fence story. Everybody wants a single family home. Everybody wants, a white picket fence. Everybody wants a car in a driveway and a big backyard. And no doubt there are many people who like that. But increasingly, people don't want that because it's unaffordable, it's too expensive, it has a whole bunch of negatives to it, and they're looking at more livable communities, very similar to the sort of density that we have here in southern Toronto. Those stories are all over the place. And we've seen recently, especially with the Greenbelt battle that started a year and a half ago, the pro-sprawl side justified eating into the Greenbelt by saying we just don't have enough land available for building all the housing we need. And the belief was, well, we're just going to have to sacrifice important environmental protections like the Greenbelt, like a whole bunch of environmental legislation in order to address the housing crisis. And they were pushing that over and over again. In fact, Premier Ford started pushing that about a year out from the 2022 election. I know that because I was paying attention to that. But here's the thing, the evidence, and this is evidence that comes from multiple sources, makes it absolutely clear that they are wrong. There is more than enough land already set aside within existing towns and cities to build all the housing we need. Indeed, if we built at density levels similar to what's found in southern Toronto, we'd have more than enough space to build, millions and millions and millions of new homes, way beyond the 1.5 million target that the Premier has set for Ontario. So the reality is, we don't need to sacrifice farmland. We don't need to sacrifice in natural areas to deal with the housing crisis. In fact, doing that creates a whole bunch of additional problems, which I'll get to shortly. So the good news is, and I just, a lot of my presentations might seem depressing, but I want all of you to know that the evidence from across the globe shows that if we build in the right place, if we stop sprawl, and if we build sustainable communities that are in existing towns and cities, they can be climate resilient. We can protect farmland, we can protect wetlands, we can protect natural areas, and we can solve the housing crisis. It's not an either or. That is a false division, and we don't need to buy into that. So let me get into the second ingredient that is key to causing the housing crisis or creating this housing crisis, and that is we spend too much time building the wrong type of housing. In the fall of 2023, we asked some academics based out of the University of British Columbia who had to work with us. They had come up with this really interesting tool called the Housing Assessment Resource Tools, HART or HART. And what they did was they took the 2021 census and they looked at all the data that was collected. And amongst other things, the data that the census collects includes, how many people live in your household? How many rooms do you have in your home? How much money, how much household income do you earn? And of course, a whole number of other questions. And they took this data and they said, let's see what the housing needs for Ontarians are. In fact, they did this for all of Canada, but we asked them to look specifically at Ontario. And so what they did was they said, okay, how many people are living in homes that are too small for them and require paying more than 30% of their income for their household income for maintaining the household? Because as I'm sure many of you know, the general rule is if you're paying more than 30% of your household income, it's unaffordable. So they did number crunching, and they really interesting data, and this gives you a snapshot of it. But the bottom line is there is a huge demand for 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom units less so for 4-bedroom units, even less so for 5-bedroom units. But there are, what this tells us is that there are a lot of people in Ontario as of 2021 who are living in units that are too small for them and where they're paying way too much money. And it's important to keep in mind that this census probably did not capture students, nor did it capture the homeless people. Now, interestingly, so this gives us a snapshot of what sort of housing we need. Unfortunately, though, we're still building housing that actually doesn't meet that needs. And I think, as anyone knows who spends any time in Toronto and in the Greater Toronto area or the Greater Golden Horseshoe, just outside the 905, we see there's still we're still building too many small condos in large concrete towers and too many single homes that people don't need and can't afford. Now, things are changing a bit, but you hear over and over again, and this comes back to the narrative, that the story that Premier Ford is pushing, which is, we all want white picket fences and, with backyards and garages, blah, blah, blah. They're still pushing the construction of housing units that don't fit the housing needs of people. What the housing needs of people are actually what are often deemed as missing middle housing. So, for example, the picture near the center, that if you look carefully, there's 4 mailboxes to what appears to be a kind of a single-family residential house. Well, in fact, there are 4 units in that house. To the right of that, at the bottom right corner, that's a laneway house. Happens to be my laneway house. That's just in the backyard. We had a laneway house built in 2021, where my spouse and I will eventually move into, and hopefully we built it to age in place, etc. It's 2 bedrooms. It's a great use of space. There used to be a garage there. Then just above that, there's I think it's probably a 7-story, 8-story building. I believe that's on College Street. But they're probably different sized bedroom apartment units in there, 2-3 bedrooms, etc. And then at the far left, of course, it's an older building, kind of a multi-residential building. We need more of this. That's what the data suggests. Well, why are we building the wrong type of housing? Why are we building too many condo, postage stamp condos and single family homes? Well, for a number of reasons. Bad planning policies at the provincial and municipal levels. The development industry is dominated by developers who benefit from building sprawl, benefit from land speculation that fuels sprawl, or they benefit from huge concrete building huge concrete towers. I've spoken to a whole bunch of developers over the last number of months who say, we want to build more missing middle. We want to build more 8-10-story buildings out of wood. But it's challenging for them to do that, because in many ways the rules are stacked against them. Now, to be fair, there's also a false perception that missing middle housing will harm property values. There's a lot of fear to change out there, especially from people who are in residential neighborhoods. And that, I think, comes from not understanding what it actually means. A perfect example of that is in my neighborhood. When we started building our laneway house, we had a number of neighbors express real concern about it, saying, well, is it going to affect property values? Is it going to harm our sites, etc. After it was built, instead of people coming and saying we don't like it, we've had a large number of people coming and saying, this is really beautiful. Can you tell us more about your process? Because they're now interested in pursuing that. Now, interestingly, another kind of example of where the Premier is on this. This is from an article that was posted on the Global News website today, where Premier Ford at a press conference this morning essentially said there is no way that the province is going to mandate 4plexes in neighborhoods across the province. This is a no-brainer policy. It essentially says, if you've got a big single-family house, a 4plex a policy would say that you could turn that into 4 units, or you could tear down an older building, an older single-family house, and put up a building with 4 units. He's against that, but he's okay if that small building is torn down and a huge McMansion is put up, which would have the same footprint and same floor space as a fourplex. So this is yet another example of the Premier and the province very deliberately making the decision to support the wrong type of housing being built and not building the sort of housing that people actually need. The third ingredient that is making for the big housing crisis we are in is a lack of real investment in non-market housing. And I want to come back to this chart that I showed earlier, this housing needs assessment that the UBC academics did for us. And I want to focus on these 2 numbers where the red arrows are pointing. This is the total number of housing units needed for very low, the first number, 71,565, are the number of units needed for people who have very low income. And they need rents at about $455 a month to be able to live in these units. And then for people who are low income Ontarians, who if you were only to ask them to spend 30% of their gross household income on rent, would need units at about $1,140 a month. There's a need for almost 425,000 units. In total, there is a demand for a minimum of 500,000 units for effectively non-market units, because there's no way that these 500,000 people will ever earn enough money to be able to afford rent in market units. So there is a huge, huge need for non-market housing. Now, as I think many of you probably know, but I found this a very, very interesting graphic. This comes from Carolyn Witzman. She's a professor at the University of Ottawa who's written a lot about housing, has worked in Australia, has expertise on housing solutions in Europe. She put together this graph which shows federally assisted affordable housing units from 1946 to 2019. And for those of you who are my age and older, you will remember in the early 1980s when the beginnings of well, government has to get out of the business of providing particular public services. That became the beginning of a reduction in federal money going towards building housing units after decades of dramatic levels of building affordable housing. And then we see by the late, or I guess that stopped in '92. My apologies. It started going down, and then by the mid 1990s, the federal government was pretty well out of the business. They of course downloaded a lot of non-market housing to the province, and then the province downloaded a lot of non-market housing to municipalities. But by and large, very few federal dollars were being put into building non-market housing. Now, of course, what we need is more of that. We need more St. Lawrence neighborhoods. I found this on the Wordsworth Co-op website when I was putting this together. I think this was from 1981 or 82. We need this type of housing. We need a lot of it. We need a huge investment in non-market housing, because it's clear after 40 years of hoping and creating policies that would hopefully get the private market to build deeply affordable housing. It's just not happening. So there's still a number of people who just don't see the benefits of investing in non-market housing. And I think it's important to kind of acknowledge what those benefits are. First and foremost, it's actually a really important way in which to address the homelessness crisis that we're facing in Toronto, in Southern Ontario, across Canada. The only way we're going to deal with that is by building non-market housing. Now, between now and that non-market housing being ready for occupancy, we need to come up with some temporary measures. But temporary measures aren't good enough. We need a true solution, and the solution is building and investing in non-market housing. The other benefit of non-market housing is that you end up building the housing types people need, because what's driving the non-market housing construction isn't the profit motive, rather it's needs. Housing providers, co-ops, not-for-profit organizations, even municipal, city-run non-market housing corporations, their decisions about what to build are based on what do people need. So the needs that were identified by the UBC research would probably be met, would be met with non-market housing. Non-market housing, of course, keeps rents affordable and provides housing stability, because once you're in non-market housing, you know you're not going to be kicked out by a landlord who may want to do a rent eviction at some point, or for whatever reason wants to get you out. Another big benefit of investing in non-market housing is that it reduces the number of other social problems and costs associated with precarious housing. I think we all know that there are significant other costs that result from people who are homeless or who are in a precarious housing situation. Guess what? We have to pay for that, and that's throwing it's absolutely good that we are providing these services, but we could save those. We could eliminate a significant portion of that if we actually created sufficient non-market housing for people in need. And finally, another benefit is that it actually takes pressure off the for-profit sector to supply deeply affordable rental housing. There are some for-profit developers who really want to do deeply affordable rental housing, but they haven't figured out a formula to do it. Not due to a lack of desire, but just the finances, the economics of it aren't right. Having the federal, provincial, and municipal governments investing heavily in non-market housing, it would take that pressure off of the for-profit sector. So the fourth ingredient I want to talk about that deals to the housing creates the housing crisis is high construction costs and lengthy builds. I know some of this firsthand because we had a laneway house built. And I've talked to a lot of developers who want to build missing middle housing, who want to build more affordable housing. But the challenges they face is that a lot of building is based on old construction methods. Methods that probably many of them go back to the 19th century. Yes, they have power tools now, but a lot of it is, you just build everything on site. Increasingly, in many jurisdictions across the planet now, a lot of a house can actually, or home or a building can be built offsite, almost like in a factory. You build panels, you build walls, you bring them to the site and you assemble them there. That dramatically reduces the amount of time required to build it. It also reduces the costs. Another pinch point that's driving up costs is lack of skilled labor. The demand right now for construction workers is significantly outpaces the number that are there. That raises costs. If you use more newer construction methods, the demand for skilled labor goes down, or it changes as they start working in factories building parts of houses. But another big thing that drives up costs is the misallocating limited construction resources to suburban sprawling, the wrong types of building. In a world right now where there are resource constraints, here in Ontario especially, where you only have a limited amount of construction material, when you only have a limited amount of workers, every house you put up in a suburban setting means resources and construction material that's not available for building missing middle housing in existing towns and cities, which means that the price for if you want to build existing towns and cities, build housing within existing towns and cities, you're competing for that labor, which means that costs go even higher. And then the final issue I want to raise about driving up costs is it's government tax and planning policies that promote the construction of the wrong types of housing. Premier Ford's announcement today that he's not going to mandate fourplexes, that is a way of driving up costs, because It essentially sends a signal to all of the developers out there that want to build within existing towns and cities. We're not going to support you. You're going to have to compete for those precious labor and precious construction. That means prices just go up. The final ingredient I want to talk about that is part of the housing crisis recipe, is, if you will, is too little focus on affordability and livability. What is reducing affordability and livability? We know that there are significant dysfunctional landlord and tenant laws and policies. I speak to a lot of people who are tenants. I know landlords. One thing that they all share in common is that the current regime is not working. It's taking way too long to resolve issues. There are loopholes that are taken advantage of by unscrupulous landlords, also by unscrupulous tenants that are creating just a terrible, terrible situation. And it means that that rents are sky high, and it also means that it takes a long time to deal with disputes. Another factor or cause of lack of affordability and livability is that we got too many investors looking for quick returns and treating housing like a consumer good. You know, housing is not like a piece of clothing. It is an important, necessary thing that we all need. Many argue, I personally agree, it is a right, but we have created a situation with tax laws and other policies that almost provide incentives for investors to go in there and just treat it like any other commodity. There's also a lot of people are downplaying the importance of social and physical infrastructure. There's a lot of discussion happening about building. You know, we just have to get something built without an acknowledgement that building housing, and it doesn't matter if it's in suburbia, if it doesn't matter if it's in downtown Toronto, if you don't have the supporting social and physical infrastructure there, creates its own set of problems and creates an unlivable towns, unlivable neighborhoods. If you don't have schools, if you don't have park space, if you don't have the sort of retail that you need, and I don't mean, the kind of typical corporate retail, but retail that expresses a community, you're not creating a livable community. These are important to a lot of people and they need to be acknowledged. And finally, what's reducing affordability and livability? It's all the things I've been talking about. Building in the wrong places, building the wrong type of housing, not investing in non-market housing, high construction costs, all of those contribute to reducing affordability and livability. Now, I've given you what I consider the kind of the recipe, the key ingredients of what's causing the housing crisis, and it's a pretty depressing picture. But I also want to give you hope, and one of the reasons that we created the Alliance for Liveable Ontario was actually to provide hope for people, to say there are solutions. And what we want to do and what we're working towards is we want to provide hope. We want to provide people with information so that they have understandable common sense solutions at their fingertips that they can share with their networks, with their neighbors, and with their elected officials. And so we decided a number of months ago, as I said, we wanted to put together a report. And at first we thought we were going to be writing a report that was similar to many of the reports that have come out from housing experts. But more recently, there's been a kind of a change in thinking. We thought, well, really, what we need is a report that everyday Ontarians can understand. People who aren't housing experts but care and and want to do something about solving the housing crisis. So we're coming up with a report. The audience are everyday Ontarians. The process, we brought together leaders from various sectors. Some of them are already members of the Alliance for Liveable Ontario, others aren't. And we're working together to find common ground on a set of solutions. And what we want to produce, what we're hoping will be done over the next month or two, is we want to come up with an easy to understand report with solutions that make sense to people, that you can read and you can go, yep, not only do I get this, I can explain this to my neighbor. And not surprisingly, we're organizing we're tracking towards organizing the report into kind of 5 action areas, and not surprisingly, these mirror what I was just talking about. There are 5 kind of things that governments can do, province in particular, because it has a lot of control over planning, but as well the federal government, which has a lot of fiscal capacity. They raise taxes. They help fund housing. So the 5 areas are: number 1, build in the right places. Secondly, is build to maximize the types and size of housing that's available. In particular, housing that meets the needs that people have. Build smarter and faster to reduce construction costs. Invest heavily in non-market affordable housing. That means serious investments by the federal government in particular, but also the province in building non-market housing, much like what happened in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And finally, make housing affordable and livable. Now, over the coming next weeks, we're going to be filling out, I hope, each of these action areas with more specific recommendations. But they will not be recommendations that you would find coming from a report written by housing experts. They will, fingers crossed, be recommendations written by people who are non-housing experts, but want to communicate to their neighbors, to everyday Ontarians about solutions. And finally, what I'm hoping this will lead to, and what I'm hoping you can commit to doing, is we'd love for you to join the Alliance for Liveable Ontario. And by joining, it essentially means agreeing to the 5 principles I set out at the outset. And that puts you on our mailing list, and that means you get communications from us about what we're up to. When we have the housing report written, fingers crossed, in about a month from now, we're going to be shopping it around to civil society groups, to ratepayer associations like those of you who are part of FoSTRA. And we want to get as many civil society groups as possible to endorse the report, of course, assuming they agree to it. And but we also want people to share the report with your networks, because the way in which we're going to solve the housing crisis, I truly believe, is by getting as many Ontarians as possible saying the same thing. And by the same thing, I'm hoping some versions of these 5 bullet points. And if enough of us are saying that over and over and over again, elected officials are going to have to listen to us. Because one of the key lessons I learned from the Greenbelt battle, which, as many of you know, the Ford government was ready to allow housing on the Greenbelt, and then after huge public pushback, they stopped that. They reversed that decision. That happened because people across the province were talking to their elected officials with a common message. We hope that our report will help us lead, will help you come up with a message that you agree with and that you can be promoting to your networks. So with that, I say thank you very much. You can contact us at info@liveableontario.ca. That's on our website. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to Michael.
Thanks very much, Franz. It was just a very complex and complete presentation. And just to wrap our heads around it, we do have a couple of questions from the pre-registration. And there was got a notice that some people might have had difficulty accessing the Q&A. So if you do have a question that you'd like to ask Franz, you can either use the chat, use the Q&A, or raise your hand, and we'll get to those questions as soon as possible. So we'll start off with Liz, who can ask the first question from the registration form.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. All right. How do we ensure that the most vulnerable members of society are given top priority in your blueprint?
Great question. I think that when the first step well, there's two parts to this. The first part is that we need temporary solutions to house our homeless neighbors. I cannot profess to be an expert on that, and that's kind of that gets into a level of detail that we have not gotten into at this point. And that is an important thing that needs to be done. And there are a lot of solutions that are already out there. Number of people are have been suggesting, you know, building kind of tiny homes. There's a whole slew of solutions. I don't know the details of that, but I know that they're there. Bottom line, it typically requires funding from governments. The second part is that we need to create long-term solutions, and that is all about you know, dramatically increasing investment in non-market housing. And if I had my way, I would say that when new non-market housing goes online, homeless neighbors should be the first in line. They should be the first ones who get the keys. I think that's what needs to happen, but that's my personal opinion.
So I hear you saying that there's some short-term solutions and some longer-term solutions, and you're going to work on both of those?
We're for sure focusing on the most important part of the long-term solution is getting federal and provincial governments back into funding non-market housing. That's something that I know that you know, that's going to have the biggest bang for the buck. The short-term solutions, the challenge we face with the alliance is that there are so many different. We're trying to deal with the housing crisis at a 40,000-foot level, and the homeless issue is an extremely important and a priority issue. We just don't have the expertise right now for me to say we're going to be focusing on this or calling on X or Y. That may happen in the future, but that level of detail will not be in this housing blueprint.
Thank you.
Okay. Just want to ask a question, Liz, excuse me, that we have the residents associations here, and what sort of things can we do to really get the federal, provincial, and municipal governments working together on the housing crisis?
Yeah. So I've been involved in advocacy work in various ways since about 1990. And as I'd like to say, over those now, I guess, 34 years, I've pretty well made every mistake I can think of making. And some of the things that I've learned, probably the most important lesson that I've learned, is that the best way to get elected officials to stop doing something bad and to start doing something good is by getting enough of their constituents demanding this. Having good ideas isn't enough. Having the right reports isn't enough. It's getting the people to actually connect with the elected officials and saying, we want you to start doing this. And that is that method applied to this particular situation is we need to get people across Toronto, across the Greater Golden Horseshoe, telling their provincial and federal elected officials, invest heavily in non-market housing. This has to become a priority. We have to do what we did back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. That's the only solution to the affordability crisis and to be blunt, to the homelessness issue as well.
Okay, Liz?
Yes. A question that's related to that, to the first question, are there ways to use vacant buildings as temporary homes until they're permanently occupied?
Again, it's a level of expertise. I do not have expertise in this. You know,
Okay.
with my very, very limited knowledge of this, there probably are vacant buildings out there that could be used by homeless, our homeless neighbors. The challenge, of course, is always ensuring that they're safe and that they are that they're also in places where the services that our homeless neighbors need is available. So no doubt there are some of those buildings available, and I think it would be a great idea to have municipalities to begin doing an inventory of where are these buildings that are safe that people could live in.
Thank you. That was a pre-presentation question, so it didn't quite fit into your presentation. And here's another one, but it is on your website, I think. What are the consequences of the Get It Done Act, Bill 162?
Yeah. So Bill 162 was I think the most polite way of saying it is a dog's breakfast of proposals and changes and ideas that they're all over the place. Most of them are bad. The one that probably has the biggest negative impact on dealing with the housing crisis is stuck in the middle of this, where I think it was Schedule 3, and it had some innocuous title of, amending the official planning acts of select municipalities. And what this did was it expanded what's called the urban boundary. And this is where I have to get into a bit of planning jargon. Every municipality has what's called an urban boundary. That's a fancy way of saying it's the boundary and inside that boundary, you can have development. And if land is outside of that boundary, it cannot be developed. Well, the province expanded the urban boundary for a whole bunch of different municipalities across the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Right. Not because the municipalities didn't have enough land to build all the housing they needed, but because, frankly, there were probably a number of land speculators who would make a lot of money if land that was outside the urban boundary was inside the urban boundary. And so that was, by doing that, it also sends a signal to developers, we want you to build more suburban sprawl. And that is very, very dangerous.
Right. I don't see any other questions. Michael, did you think of any more?
No, and I'm not seeing any from the chat right now. If anyone has a question for Franz, you can raise your hand and please ask the question. And Don has a question. Okay, Don, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to ask if Franz and ALO has played a part in Caledon's official plan discussions, because there's a big debate going on there.
Short answer is I have not been personally involved, but I have no doubt that there are Alliance for Liveable Ontario members and member groups that have been involved in that. One of the wonderful things about the Alliance is that we've got so many people working on stuff. It would take me probably 80 hours a week just to keep track of who's doing what. And it's not really necessary. But I do know that there are groups across the Greater Golden Horseshoe who are fighting bad planning policies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Don. And do we have any other questions? And seeing none, I'm going to say thank you very much, Franz, for joining us this evening and giving us a very thorough presentation. I also want to thank all the people who joined us tonight, and our special guest, thanks to our representatives and constituency office members who joined us as well. The big thanks to Franz Hartmann and Chris Glover for their time tonight. So we'll have this presentation available. I have some other things to do to the video, but we'll be posting the video, and I'm hoping that Franz will be able to allow us to share the slide deck with everybody going forward. So you'll have the video, you'll have the slide deck, and a transcript of what transpired here. So thank you very much again, Franz, and we look forward to working with you over the next little while when we get the ALO report. And thanks for everybody. So we'll see you again at our next webinar coming up within the next couple of months. Once again,
Thank you very
all.
much. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.